Welcome to One Chapter, One Thought. I'm Pastor Chris from Lincroft Bible Church in New Jersey, and every weekday I read one chapter of the Bible and offer one brief devotional thought. Today's reading is from the book of Ezekiel, chapter 40. On April 28th, during the 25th year of our captivity, 14 years after the fall of Jerusalem, the Lord took hold of me. In a vision from God, he took me to the land of Israel and set me down on a very high mountain. From there I could see toward the south what appeared to be a city. As he brought me near, I saw a man whose face shone like bronze, standing beside a gateway entrance. He was holding in his hand a linen measuring cord and a measuring rod. He said to me, "Son of man, watch and listen. Pay close attention to everything I show you. You have been brought here so I can show you many things. Then you will return to the people of Israel and tell them everything you have seen." I could see a wall completely surrounding the temple area. The man took the measuring rod that was 10.5 feet long and measured the wall, and the wall was 10.5 feet thick and 10.5 feet high. Then he went over to the eastern gateway. He climbed the steps and measured the threshold of the gateway. It was 10.5 feet front to back. There were guard alcoves on each side built into the gateway passage. Each of these alcoves was 10.5 feet square, with a distance between them of 8.75 feet along the passage wall. The gateway's inner threshold, which led to the entry room at the inner end of the gateway passage, was 10.5 feet front to back. He also measured the entry room of the gateway. It was 14 feet across, with supporting columns 3.5 feet thick. This entry room was at the inner end of the gateway structure, facing toward the temple. There were 3 guard alcoves on each side of the gateway passage. Each had the same measurements, and the dividing walls separating them were identical. The man measured the gateway entrance, which was 17.5 feet wide at the opening, and 22.75 feet wide in the gateway passage. In front of each of the guard alcoves was a 21-inch curb. The alcoves themselves were 10.5 feet on each side. Then he measured the entire width of the gateway, measuring the distance between the back walls of facing guard alcoves. This distance was 43.75 feet. He measured the dividing walls all along the inside of the gateway up to the entry room of the gateway. This distance was 105 feet. The full length of the gateway passage was 87.5 feet from one end to the other. There were recessed windows that narrowed inward through the walls of the guard alcoves and their dividing walls. There were also windows in the entry room. The surfaces of the dividing walls were decorated with carved palm trees. Then the man brought me through the gateway into the outer courtyard of the temple. A stone pavement ran along the walls of the courtyard, and 30 rooms were built against the walls opening onto the pavement. This pavement flanked the gates and extended out from the walls into the courtyard, the same distance as the gateway entrance. This was the lower pavement. Then the man measured across the temple's outer courtyard between the outer and inner gateways. The distance was 175 feet. The man measured the gateway on the north just like the one on the east. Here, too, there were 3 guard alcoves on each side, with dividing walls and an entry room. All the measurements matched those of the east gateway. The gateway passage was 87.5 feet long and 43.75 feet wide between the back walls of the facing guard alcoves. The windows, the entry room, the palm tree decorations were identical to those in the east gateway. There were 7 steps leading up to the gateway entrance, and the entry room was at the inner end of the gateway passage. Here on the north side, just as on the east, there were another gateway leading to the temple's inner courtyard directly opposite this outer gateway. The distance between the 2 gateways was 175 feet. Then the man took me around the south gateway and measured its various parts, and they were exactly the same as in the others. It had windows along the walls as the others did, and there was an entry room where the gateway passage opened into the outer courtyard. And like others, the gateway passage was 87.5 feet long and 43.75 feet wide between the back walls of facing guard alcoves. This gateway also had a stairway of 7 leading up to it, and an entry room at the inner end, and the palm tree decorations along the dividing walls. Here again, directly opposite the outer gateway, was another gateway that led into the inner courtyard. The distance between the two gateways was 175 feet. Then the man took me to the south gateway leading into the inner courtyard. He measured it, and it had the same measurements as the other gateways. Its guard alcoves, dividing walls, and entry rooms were the same size as those in the others. It had windows along its walls and entry room, and like the others, the gateway passage was 87.5 feet long and 43.75 feet wide. The entry rooms of the gateway leading into the inner courtyard were 14 feet across and 43.75 feet wide. The entry room to the south gateway faced into the outer courtyard. It had palm tree decorations on its columns, and there were 8 steps leading to its entrance. Then he took me to the east gateway leading to the inner courtyard. He measured it, and it had the same measurements as the other gateways. Its guard alcoves, dividing walls, and entry room were the same size as those of the others, and there were windows along the walls and the entry room. The gateway passage, around 87.5 feet long and 43.75 feet wide. Its entry room faced into the outer courtyard. It had palm tree decorations on its column, and there were 8 steps leading to its entrance. Then he took me around to the north gateway leading to the inner courtyard. He measured it, and it had the same measurements as the other gateways. The guard alcoves, dividing walls, and entry room of this gateway had the same measurements as in the others, and the same window arrangements. The gateway passage measured 87.5 feet long and 43.75 feet wide. Its entry room faced into the outer courtyard, and it had palm tree decorations on the columns. There were 8 steps leading to its entrance. A door led from the entry room of one of the inner gateways into a side room where the meat for sacrifice was washed. On each side of this entry room were 2 tables, where the sacrificial animals were slaughtered for the burnt offerings, sin offerings, and guilt offerings. Outside the entry room, on each side of the stairs going up to the north entrance, were 2 more tables. So there were 8 tables in all, 4 inside and 4 outside, where the sacrifices were cut up and prepared. There were also 4 tables of finished stone for preparation of the burnt offerings, each 31.5 inches square and 21 inches high. On these tables were placed the butchering knives and other implements for slaughtering the sacrificial animals. There were hooks, each 3 inches long, fastened all around the foyer walls. The sacrificial meat was laid on the tables. Inside the inner courtyard were 2 rooms, one beside the north gateway, facing south, and the other beside the south gateway, facing north. And the man said to me, "The rooms besides the north inner gate is for the priests who supervise the temple maintenance. The room beside the south inner gate is for priests in charge of the altar, the descendants of Zadok, for they alone of all the Levites may approach the Lord to minister to him." Then the man measured the inner courtyard, and it was square, 175 feet wide and 175 feet across. The altar stood in the courtyard in the front temple. Then he brought me to the entry room of the temple, and he measured the walls on either side of the opening to the entry room, and they were 8.75 feet thick. The entrance itself was 24.5 feet wide, and the walls on each side of the entrance were an additional 5.25 feet long. The entry room was 35 feet wide and 21 feet deep. There were 10 steps leading up to it, with a column on each side. One thought. After the deliverance of God's people through the defeat of Gog in chapters 38 and 39, Ezekiel now sees a vision of the complete renewal of God's people in Ezekiel 40 through 48. Unfortunately, these chapters are some of the most debated chapters in the Old Testament, and the debate typically centers on whether the temple depicted in these chapters will literally be rebuilt at some point in the future, or whether it is a more symbolic representation of renewal for God's people. And I think that this debate is a bit unfortunate because it can obscure some of the beauty and richness that we can glean from these chapters even today. I wonder if there's an intentional ambiguity in these chapters that we really can't pin down a definitive view, literal versus symbolic, because there's credence for each. Obviously, there's much detail in this vision about the temple, which many say, well, look, it's so detailed, then it must be literal, and yet there's these puzzling omissions in the text and different features in the text that might lend it to a more symbolic reading. The fact that, number one, it is a vision. It says that Ezekiel was caught up in visions of God, so clearly how we read visions should influence what this passage is. And also, even though the temple is very detailed, there's no term used for height in the construction of this temple. It shows width and depth, but no height. And so, is it intended to be literal? It's hard to know, but I think we can sidestep some of those questions to really focus, what did this mean for the people of Ezekiel's day, and what can it mean for us today as well? And when we look at this vision in Ezekiel 40, let's not miss the importance of the date. The opening date of this vision would indicate that Ezekiel had this visionary experience with the Lord about 10 years after he wrote down chapters 38 and 39. There may also be significance that this vision took place in the 25th year of the exile. The number 25 foreshadows the preponderance of the use of 25 in the temple vision, but also 25 years is halfway to the number 50. That's obvious. But the number 50 was the number of years when Israel's Jubilee year was to occur. In the Old Testament, particularly in Leviticus, it speaks of the Jubilee year where Israel all debts would be released, land would return back to its original owners, and there would just be this feasting and celebration. It is a symbolic year, an important year for the people of Israel of forgiveness, release, restoration, and celebration. And so Ezekiel may be alluding to this, that this year 25 could be a turning point, a turning of the corner for the exiles, a turning of the sights away from the tragedy of exile and pointing the people in the direction of return and restoration. But beyond the date, what we have in this vision is a picture of the reordering of the entire new world. There may be allusions to a time-honored ancient Near Eastern tradition where a divine warrior would provide a tour of his house after he completed a cosmic victory, as one commentator argues. And so this tour of the temple, it's not merely about walls and floors and square footage. It is a proclamation of victory by God over his enemies. One day, God will set everything right. And for us as New Covenant believers today, we know that God has already won the victory for us in Jesus Christ. We are more than conquerors, as the Apostle Paul writes in Romans 8:37. And while the first victory claimed was the battle for our souls, as Jesus provided forgiveness for our sins on the cross, we look with hope when Jesus will return and vindicate us as his people and usher in the complete renovation of creation.